Ralph scratched his thick, armored hide as the transport shuttle descended toward Titan Station. The purple scales along his shoulders rippled with annoyance. 3 months. 3 whole months he would waste training with these soft pink creatures that called themselves humans. His superiors had called it an essential cultural exchange program, but Ralph knew better. This was punishment for questioning Admiral Corvin's battle strategy during the last campaign. The shuttle touched down with a gentle thud on the landing platform. Through the viewport, Ralph could see human soldiers moving around in their ridiculous protective gear. His own people needed no such equipment. Their natural armor could deflect most energy weapons, and their strength was 10 times that of any human. What could these fragile beings possibly teach a warrior like him? General Hayes waited at the bottom of the shuttle ramp. The human stood barely chest-high to Ralph, wearing a simple green uniform that looked like it would tear if someone breathed on it too hard. His graying hair was cut short, and deep lines marked his weathered face. Behind him stood several other human officers, all looking equally small and unimpressive. "Commander Ralph," Hayes said, extending his hand in the strange human greeting ritual. "Welcome to Titan Station. We're honored to have you here for the joint training exercises." Ralph looked down at the offered hand but did not take it. Among his people, physical contact was reserved for combat or mating. "General Hayes, let us proceed with these exercises so I may return to real military duties." Hayes lowered his hand slowly, his expression remaining neutral. "Of course. We'll start with a tour of our facilities, then move on to tactical briefings." As they walked through the station corridors, Ralph noted how everything was built to human scale. Low ceilings, narrow doorways, delicate control panels. Even their weapons seemed like toys compared to the massive plasma cannons his people wielded. Human soldiers they passed along the way stopped to salute Hayes, but Ralph could see them stealing glances at his imposing form. Good. At least they recognized a superior warrior when they saw one. "This is our main training facility," Hayes explained as they entered a large room filled with exercise equipment. Several humans were working out, lifting weights that Ralph could move with one finger. Physical fitness remains important even in modern warfare. Ralph watched a human soldier struggle to lift a bar loaded with metal plates. Back home, younglings used heavier weights for basic coordination exercises. "Your people seem very delicate." "We make up for our physical limitations in other ways," Hayes replied calmly. They moved to the next section, where humans were practicing with various weapons. Ralph observed their techniques with growing amusement. They moved slowly, carefully, taking time to aim. Alteran warriors fought with instinct and overwhelming force. These humans looked like they were performing some kind of dance. "Your soldiers take too long to fire," Ralph commented. In real combat, the enemy would kill them before they could aim. Sergeant Miller, a young human woman demonstrating rifle techniques, overheard the comment. "With respect, sir, accuracy often matters more than speed. One well-placed shot can end a fight faster than a dozen wild ones," Ralph snorted. "One well-placed punch can end a fight even faster." Hayes led them to the command center next, where dozens of humans sat before glowing screens, monitoring data streams and communication channels. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as operators coordinated various training scenarios. "This is where we coordinate our operations," Hayes explained. "Information gathering and analysis are crucial to our success." "Your people rely too heavily on machines," Ralph said, watching the humans stare at their screens. "True warriors trust their instincts and their strength. Technology is a tool, Commander. Like any tool, it's only as good as the person using it." They spent the rest of the day reviewing human military doctrine. Ralph sat through presentations about combined arms tactics, psychological warfare, and adaptive strategy. The humans seemed obsessed with planning for every possible scenario, creating backup plans for their backup plans. They talked about force multipliers and asymmetric advantages, as if these concepts could somehow overcome raw physical superiority. During the evening briefing, Lieutenant Anderson presented a simulation of a recent human victory against the Krell pirates. The presentation showed how human forces had used deception and misdirection to defeat a numerically superior enemy. "The Krell expected a direct assault," Anderson explained. "Instead, we fed them false information and struck from an unexpected angle while they were repositioned." Ralph shook his massive head. "Deception is the weapon of the weak. Honorable warriors face their enemies directly. Honor doesn't help much if you're dead, Anderson replied quietly. That evening, Rolf sat alone in his quarters, reviewing the day's events. The humans had provided him with a bed sized for his larger frame, but everything else in the room felt cramped and insufficient. He opened his personal communicator and composed a message to his friend Commander Dex back on Altara Prime. Day 1 among the humans complete, he typed with his thick fingers. As expected, they are weak creatures who compensate with elaborate tricks and excessive technology. Their weapons are toys, their soldiers are fragile, and their tactics are overly complicated. I fail to see what our superiors hope to learn from these beings. 3 months feels like a lifetime. I will endure this assignment and return with proof that Altaran methods remain superior. Rolf sealed the message and lay back on the oversized bed. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, he was certain. More presentations about human cleverness, more demonstrations of their inadequate physical capabilities, more proof that his species stood alone as true warriors in the galaxy. Through his window, he could see human guards patrolling the station perimeter. They moved in pairs, constantly communicating with each other and the command center. Even their guard duty seemed inefficient. A single Altaran warrior could protect twice the area without assistance. As sleep took him, Rolf dreamed of the battles he was missing while stuck on this assignment. Real fights against worthy enemies where strength and courage mattered more than planning and preparation. Soon enough, he would return to that world and leave these curious little creatures to their strange ideas about warfare. He had no idea how completely wrong he was about everything. The alarm echoed through Titan Station at exactly 0347 hours, cutting through Rolf's dreams like a blade. Red lights flashed in the corridors as he squeezed through the doorway of his quarters, still adjusting his equipment belt. Human soldiers rushed past him, moving with surprising speed despite their small size. General Hayes appeared in the command center within minutes, his hair disheveled but his eyes sharp and focused. What's the situation, Anderson? Emergency transmission from New Geneva mining colony, sir, Lieutenant Anderson replied, her fingers dancing across her control panel. They're under attack by Ravager forces. Estimated strength, 3 heavy cruisers and multiple fighter squadrons. Rolf had heard of the Ravagers, brutal pirates who destroyed everything in their path, taking no prisoners and leaving no survivors. His people had fought them before, always meeting their savagery with overwhelming force. The solution was simple. Find them, close with them, destroy them. How many ships do we have available? Hayes asked. 2 destroyers and 1 cruiser, sir. The rest of the fleet is still 3 days out. Rolf stepped forward. We should depart immediately. Every moment we delay gives the enemy more time to establish their position. Hayes nodded absently, but instead of ordering immediate departure, he turned to his staff. I want a full tactical analysis within 30 minutes. Terrain studies, weather patterns, civilian population distribution, and enemy behavioral models. Get me everything, sir? Rolf could not hide his confusion. The course is obvious. We engage the enemy fleet and destroy them. With half their numbers and no knowledge of their deployment, Hayes shook his head. That's not warfare, Commander. That's suicide. What followed confused Rolf even more. Instead of rushing to battle, the humans spent 2 full hours gathering information. They studied old reports about Ravager tactics, analyzed the layout of New Geneva colony, and even reviewed psychological profiles of typical Ravager commanders. Teams of specialists pored over star charts, weather data, and supply manifests. The Ravagers always establish their main base near the most valuable targets, Dr. Sarah Williams explained during the briefing. In this case, that would be the primary mining facility. They'll use the processing plant as a fortress while their raiders spread out to gather slaves and resources. Lieutenant Rodriguez added his analysis. Historical data shows Ravager commanders tend to be overconfident when facing smaller forces. They prefer direct confrontation and rarely expect deception or misdirection. Rolf listened to this stream of data with growing impatience. His people would have been halfway to the battle by now. This information changes nothing, he declared. We know where the enemy is. We know their strength. We attack. Do we know their specific ship configurations? Hayes asked calmly. Their fighter deployment patterns? Which commanders are leading this particular force? The psychological state of their crews? The condition of their equipment? Those details are irrelevant, Rolf insisted. Superior firepower and warrior spirit decide battles, not data analysis. Hayes studied him for a moment. We'll see. The journey to New Geneva took 18 hours. During that time, Rolth expected the humans to rest or prepare their weapons. Instead, they continued their endless planning. Groups of soldiers huddled around portable displays running simulation after simulation. They practiced communication procedures, rehearsed contingency plans, and even discussed what they called emotional preparation. Fear is natural, Sergeant Lopez told her squad during one of these sessions. The goal isn't to eliminate fear, but to function despite it. Remember your training, trust your teammates, and keep your objectives clear. Rolth found these discussions incomprehensible. Alteran warriors conquered fear through strength and honor. They needed no elaborate mental preparation or group discussions. Fear either existed or it did not. If it existed, the warrior was weak. If it did not, the warrior was strong. Even more puzzling was the human tendency to share personal stories during the journey. Soldiers talked about their families, their homes, their reasons for fighting. They showed each other pictures and letters, forming what they called emotional bonds. Rolth's people fought for glory and conquest. These humans seemed to fight for abstract concepts like protecting the innocent and defending freedom. My daughter just turned 5 last month, Private Davis shared with his squad. She drew me a picture of her and me fighting space monsters together. I promised I'd come home and help her color in the rest. My mom used to make the best apple pie, Corporal Jackson added. Said she'd teach me the recipe when I got back. Guess I better make sure I get back. Rolth observed these exchanges with a mixture of amusement and disgust. Emotional attachment made warriors weak. It created hesitation in crucial moments and clouded tactical judgment. His own people understood this instinctively. They fought as individuals who happened to work together, not as some kind of extended family unit. As they approached New Geneva, the scale of destruction became visible on the main screen. 3 massive Ravager ships hung in orbit around the colony like predatory birds. Smoke rose from multiple impact sites on the surface, and debris clouds marked the remains of the colony's defense platforms. Sensors detect approximately 2,000 civilians still alive in the underground shelters, Anderson reported. Ravager landing parties are conducting sweep and capture operations. Hayes studied the tactical display with intensity that Rolth finally recognized as professional focus. Their flagship is positioned here, covering the main approach vector. Lighter ships patrol the flanks. Standard Ravager formation. Then we know exactly how to attack them, Rolth said, pointing at the flagship. Strike the center with maximum force. Destroy their command ship and the rest will scatter. Or they'll converge on us from 3 directions and destroy us within minutes, Hayes replied. Their formation is designed to channel attackers into a crossfire. So we avoid the crossfire, Lieutenant Commander Park suggested. Approach from the system's edge. Use the asteroid field for cover and coordinate our strike with the surface teams. What surface teams? Rolth demanded. Hayes smiled for the first time since the crisis began. The ones we're about to deploy. Rodriguez, prepare the infiltration teams. Williams, I want detailed geological surveys of the mining tunnels. Jackson, coordinate with the civilian leadership about evacuation routes. Rolth watched in amazement as the humans began implementing a plan that seemed impossibly complex. Instead of the simple, direct attack he advocated, they were organizing multiple simultaneous operations involving space combat, surface insertion, civilian evacuation, and what they called psychological warfare. You're making this too complicated, he protested. The enemy expects you to be clever. Strike hard and fast before they can react. The enemy expects us to be predictable, Hayes corrected. And that expectation is about to become their greatest weakness. As the human ships moved into position and the infiltration teams prepared for deployment, Rolth felt a strange mixture of anticipation and doubt. Everything he knew about warfare suggested this elaborate plan would fail. Too many moving parts, too many chances for error. Too much reliance on coordination rather than individual strength. But something in Hayes's confident demeanor suggested the general knew exactly what he was doing. Despite himself, Rolth found his curiosity growing. Perhaps these humans would surprise him after all. The first thing that struck Rolth about human combat was how quiet it seemed from space. He had expected the chaos and roar of battle, but watching the tactical displays showed something entirely different. Human forces moved like drops of water finding the cracks in stone, flowing around Ravager positions and striking from unexpected angles. "Alpha Team is in position," came the whispered report from Lieutenant Torres on the surface. "Ravager patrol just passed our location. We have visual on the mining complex." Rolf watched the main display as tiny blue dots representing human soldiers crept across the colony map. They moved in small groups, avoiding direct confrontation with the larger Ravager forces. This looked nothing like the glorious battles he was accustomed to. "Why don't they attack?" he asked Hayes. "Your soldiers outnumber that patrol 3-1. "Because eliminating one patrol accomplishes nothing," Hayes replied without taking his eyes off the display. "But allowing that patrol to continue its routine gives us information about enemy movements and keeps them unaware of our presence." Private Davis crept through the shadows between two damaged buildings, carrying what looked like a child's toy compared to Alteron weapons. A massive Ravager warrior rounded the corner ahead of him, standing nearly as tall as Rolf himself, and armed with a plasma cannon that could level buildings. By every law of combat Rolf understood, Davis should have died in the next few seconds. Instead, something impossible happened. Davis didn't run or charge. He simply vanished into a doorway and waited. When the Ravager passed by, Davis emerged behind him and attached a small device to the alien's weapon pack. Then he disappeared again before the Ravager could turn around. 30 seconds later, the device activated, overloading the plasma cannon's power core and taking out not just the Ravager, but the two vehicles he was guarding. How did he know the weapon would overload? Rolf demanded. Davis studied Ravager equipment schematics during the journey here, Sergeant Lopez explained over the comm. He identified a weakness in their power coupling system and prepared an exploit. Rolf stared at the tactical display as similar scenes played out across the battlefield. Human soldiers weren't fighting the enemy directly. They were fighting the enemy's equipment, their communication systems, their supply lines, even their psychology. What had seemed like chaos from a distance revealed itself as an intricate dance of cause and effect. "Bravo, team. Enemy reinforcements approaching your position," Anderson warned from the ship. "Copy that," came the calm reply from Corporal Williams. "Initiating misdirection protocol." Rolf watched as Williams' team split into 3 groups. 2 groups created false energy signatures that appeared on Ravager sensors as much larger forces, drawing the enemy reinforcements toward empty buildings. Meanwhile, the 3rd group slipped past the now unguarded objective and secured the civilian evacuation route. "They're using their weakness as a strength," Rolf muttered, beginning to understand something fundamental about human tactics. "Exactly," Hayes nodded. "The enemy expects us to be strong where we're weak, so we're weak where they expect us to be strong." The space battle began with similar confusion. The human ships approached the Ravager fleet in a formation that looked completely wrong to Rolf's trained eye. They came in too close together, presenting an easy target for concentrated fire. The Ravager commander took the bait immediately, ordering all 3 ships to converge on what appeared to be a foolish human mistake. "All ships, execute pattern Delta," Hayes ordered calmly. What happened next redefined Rolf's understanding of naval combat. The seemingly vulnerable human formation suddenly exploded outward like a flower blooming in reverse. Each ship had been masking 2 smaller vessels, turning 3 apparent targets into 9 actual ones. The Ravager ships found themselves surrounded by enemies that had appeared from nowhere. But even that wasn't the end of the human strategy. As the confused Ravager captains tried to reorganize their formation, they discovered that human infiltration teams had been quietly sabotaging their ship systems for the past hour. Engines failed at crucial moments, weapons misfired, and communication arrays went silent. The fearsome Ravager fleet began falling apart from within. "The humans were already aboard their ships?" Rolf asked in amazement. "Stealth insertion during their initial attack run," Commander Park explained. "While they were focused on our obvious ships, our real insertion craft slipped through their sensor grid. On the surface, the coordinated assault reached its climax. Human forces didn't charge the enemy positions as Rolf expected. Instead, they turned the Ravager's own tactics against them. The mining complex that the pirates had chosen as their fortress became a trap. Human engineers had spent the past hour quietly rerouting the facility's power grid, and when they activated their plan, the entire complex became a massive electrical weapon. Private Davis appeared on the comm again, this time leading a group of rescued civilians toward the evacuation ships. Package secure, sir. All civilians accounted for and moving to safety. Ralph noticed something in Davis's voice he had never heard from an Alteran warrior. Not pride in personal victory, but relief that others were safe. The human soldier seemed more concerned with protecting the weak than with proving his own strength. Your people fight very strangely, Ralph admitted to Hayes as they watched the last Ravager ship surrender, rather than face complete destruction. We fight the way our nature demands, Hayes replied. We're not the strongest or fastest species in the galaxy. We're not the most technologically advanced or the most naturally gifted warriors, but we have other advantages, such as, Hayes gestured toward the tactical display, where blue dots representing human soldiers were now moving through the colony, helping with rescue operations instead of celebrating their victory. We remember that the point of fighting isn't to prove how strong we are. It's to protect what we care about. Ralph watched human medics treating wounded Ravager prisoners alongside their own injured soldiers. He saw engineers working to restore power to civilian areas before repairing military installations. He observed soldiers sharing their rations with hungry colonists while going without food themselves. Your warriors show mercy to defeated enemies, he noted with confusion. The war is over, Hayes said simply. Now the work begins. As the rescue operations continued, Ralph found himself studying individual human soldiers more carefully. They moved with a fluid coordination he had mistaken for weakness. When one soldier fell behind, others slowed to help without being ordered. When unexpected problems arose, they adapted instantly, creating solutions from whatever materials were available. Most surprising of all, they seemed to grow stronger under pressure rather than weaker. The more difficult the situation became, the more creative and determined their responses. It was as if adversity activated some hidden potential in their species. I think I begin to understand, Ralph said slowly. Your people don't fight with strength. You fight with intelligence. Hayes smiled slightly. Intelligence, cooperation, adaptability, and something else you might not have a word for. We fight with hope. Hope? The belief that things can be better than they are. That the future can be different from the past. That even when everything seems impossible, there's still a chance if you're willing to try hard enough. Ralph considered this as he watched the last civilian transport lift off from the colony surface. The battle was over, the civilians were safe, and the Ravager threat had been neutralized. By any measure, the humans had achieved complete victory. Yet they had done it in a way that seemed to violate every principle of warfare he had learned. Perhaps, he thought, that was exactly the point. The celebration was short-lived. Emergency alarms began blaring again, just as the medical teams finished treating the last of the wounded. Anderson's face went pale as she read the incoming sensor data. Sir, we have multiple contacts approaching fast. Ravager reinforcement fleet. Estimated arrival in 40 minutes. Hayes studied the new tactical information with grim concentration. How many ships? 12 heavy cruisers, sir. Plus fighter escort. They're broadcasting surrender demands on all frequencies. Ralph felt a familiar surge of excitement. Now this would be a proper battle. 12 ships against their remaining 3 vessels offered much better odds for glorious combat. His people would welcome such a challenge. We should retreat immediately, Hayes announced to the stunned command center. Gather our people and fall back to rally point 7. Ralph could not believe what he was hearing. Retreat? But we just achieved victory here. This is the time to press our advantage. What advantage? Hayes asked pointedly. We're outnumbered 4-1 by fresh enemy ships while our own vessels have exhausted most of their ammunition and taken significant damage. Numbers mean nothing if warriors fight with honor and courage, Ralph declared. Hayes fixed him with a steady gaze. Honor and courage don't repair hull breaches or reload missile tubes, Commander. The withdrawal began immediately, but it was nothing like the chaotic retreats Ralph had witnessed from defeated armies. Human forces moved with the same methodical precision they had shown during the attack. Equipment was efficiently packed, wounded soldiers were carefully evacuated, and defensive positions were systematically dismantled. But then something went wrong. Sir, we have a problem, Sergeant Lopez reported from the surface. Civilian Shelter Complex 7 is showing structural damage from the earlier bombardment. We can't move the people inside without risking a complete collapse. Hayes studied the evacuation timeline on his display. The new Ravager fleet would arrive in 31 minutes. The damaged shelter was 15 minutes from the nearest transport pad. assuming perfect conditions and no complications. How many civilians? He asked. 237, sir. Mostly families with small children. Ralph watched Hayes weigh the options. Military logic demanded leaving the civilians behind to save the larger force. It was an unfortunate necessity, but battles required difficult choices. Sometimes the weak had to be sacrificed to preserve the strong. Delay the evacuation, Hayes ordered. All available personnel assist with shelter stabilization and civilian rescue. Sir, Commander Park protested, that will put the entire fleet at risk. The Ravagers will arrive before we can complete withdrawal. Then we'll have to hold them off until we can complete withdrawal, Hayes replied calmly. Ralph stared at the general in disbelief. You would risk hundreds of soldiers for 200 civilians? I would risk everything to save one civilian, Hayes answered without hesitation. That's what soldiers are for. What followed shattered every assumption Ralph had made about human warfare. Instead of the logical retreat he expected, he watched human soldiers willingly enter a hopeless situation. They knew the odds. They understood the risks. They chose to fight anyway. Sergeant Lopez led her squad into the damaged shelter complex, crawling through unstable tunnels to reach trapped families. When falling debris blocked their path, they dug through with their bare hands. When their equipment failed, they improvised solutions from scrap metal and hope. Got another family here, Lopez reported over increasingly static-filled comms, moving them to Sector 4. Private Davis and his team established a defensive perimeter around the rescue site, knowing they would soon face overwhelming enemy forces. They dug foxholes in frozen ground, set up hasty barricades, and checked their ammunition counts with the grim efficiency of people preparing to die. How long can you hold? Hayes asked over the comm. As long as necessary, sir, Davis replied simply. Ralph found himself assigned to the rescue operation despite his protests. Human engineers had determined that his natural strength could help move heavy debris that was beyond their capabilities. He worked alongside Lopez's squad in the cramped tunnels, lifting collapsed support beams while they guided terrified civilians to safety. Why do you do this? He asked Lopez as they worked to free a trapped woman. These people are not your family. They offer you nothing in return. Lopez looked at him with genuine surprise. They don't need to be my family. They're people. Isn't that enough? The first Ravager ships appeared on the horizon 18 minutes early. Their massive forms blotted out the stars as they descended toward the colony, weapons charging for orbital bombardment. But instead of immediate destruction, something unexpected happened. Lieutenant Ford contacted the incoming fleet directly. Ravager vessels. This is Lieutenant Ford of the Terran Defense Force. We have civilians in the area requiring evacuation. Request 30 minutes delay before commencing operations. Ralph was certain the pirates would laugh at such a ridiculous request. Ravagers took no prisoners and showed no mercy. But the response that came back surprised everyone. Negative, human ship. You have 5 minutes to surrender or be destroyed. Understood, Ford replied calmly. But we're not surrendering and we're not leaving. So I guess you'll have to go through us. What happened next redefined courage for Ralph. 3 damaged human ships positioned themselves between 12 fresh enemy vessels and a planet full of civilians. They had no chance of victory. They had no hope of survival. They fought anyway. The space battle was brutal and brief. Human ships used every trick they had learned. But there were limits to what tactical genius could accomplish against such overwhelming odds. One by one, their vessels took critical damage and fell back toward the planet's atmosphere. But they had bought time. Precious minutes for the rescue teams to work. Last transport loaded, Lopez reported as explosions lit up the sky above them. All civilians secure. Roger that, Hayes replied from the bridge of his burning ship. All units withdraw to Rally Point 7. Mission accomplished. Ralph watched the final evacuation with something approaching awe. Human soldiers filed aboard the transport ships in perfect order, despite the chaos exploding around them. No one ran. No one panicked. They moved with the same calm professionalism they had shown during training exercises, but some didn't make it aboard. Sergeant Lopez's squad had stayed behind to guide the last civilians to safety, and now they were trapped by advancing Ravager ground forces. The transport ships couldn't wait any longer without being destroyed. Lopez, you need to move now, Hayes ordered. Negative, sir. Still have civilians in the pipeline. Give us 2 more minutes. You don't have 2 minutes. Then we'll make the time we need. Ralph found himself running back toward the shelter complex before he consciously decided to move. His massive form crashed through Ravager battle lines like a living tank, scattering enemies and creating a corridor for the remaining civilians. He had fought in hundreds of battles, but never for a cause beyond his own glory. This felt different. This felt important. Lopez and her squad fought their way to the last transport with desperate intensity. They carried wounded civilians, guided frightened children, and held defensive positions until everyone else was safe. Only then did they allow themselves to retreat. As their transport lifted off, Ralph looked back at the colony they were leaving behind. Ravager ships were already beginning their bombardment, turning buildings to rubble and erasing all evidence of human presence. The strategic value of New Geneva was lost, but 237 civilians were safe, and somehow that seemed like victory. The human fleet limped toward Rally Point 7, with hull breaches sealed by emergency patches and life support systems running on backup power. Ralph spent the journey helping with repairs, his massive hands surprisingly gentle when handling delicate human equipment. The work gave him time to think about what he had witnessed. "The civilians are asking to speak with you," Dr. Williams told Hayes as they drifted through space. "They want to thank the rescue teams personally." Hayes shook his head. "Tell them thanks aren't necessary. We were just doing our job." Ralph watched through the viewing ports as the rescued families moved through the transport ships. Human children played games in the corridors while their parents worked alongside the crew to distribute supplies and care for the wounded. There were no class distinctions, no hierarchy of worth. Everyone contributed what they could. "Your people treat these civilians as equals," Ralph observed to Hayes. "They are equals," Hayes replied. "A farmer's life has exactly the same value as a general's life." This concept troubled Ralph deeply. In Alteran society, warriors held the highest status because they possessed the greatest strength. Civilians existed to support the military hierarchy. The idea that a weak civilian could be considered equal to a strong soldier made no logical sense. But without strength, how do they contribute to society? Hayes gestured toward a small girl who was sharing her food with a wounded soldier. "Strength takes many forms, Commander. Physical power is just one type." 3 days later, they reached Rally Point 7, where the remainder of the human fleet waited. Admiral Brooks greeted them with the news that Ravager forces had occupied New Geneva and were using it as a base to raid other colonies. The strategic situation had grown worse. "We need to retake the colony," Brooks announced during the staff meeting. "Intelligence suggests they're planning to use New Geneva as a staging area for attacks on the core systems." Ralph studied the tactical displays with renewed interest. The Ravagers had made a crucial mistake by fortifying New Geneva. They were now trapped on a fixed position, unable to use their superior mobility. This was exactly the kind of situation where Alteran tactics would prove decisive. "The solution is obvious," he declared. "Assault the planet with maximum force. The enemy is pinned in place and cannot retreat." But Hayes was shaking his head. "A direct assault would cost thousands of lives and might not even succeed. They've had time to establish proper defenses." "Then what do you propose?" Admiral Brooks asked. Hayes activated a new display showing the colony's underground mining network. "We don't attack the colony. We make the colony attack itself." What followed was the most audacious plan Ralph had ever heard. Instead of assaulting the Ravager fortifications, the humans intended to infiltrate the mining tunnels and use the colony's own industrial equipment against the occupying forces. They would turn New Geneva into a weapon pointed at its own defenders. "This is madness," Ralph protested. "The tunnels will be heavily guarded. Your infiltration teams will be detected and destroyed." "Not if they're expecting us to come from space," Hayes replied with a slight smile. "Sometimes the best way to surprise an enemy is to give them exactly what they think they want." The plan required perfect coordination between multiple elements. Surface teams would create a convincing assault that would draw Ravager attention skyward, while infiltration specialists slipped through the mining tunnels to reach the colony's power and life support systems. Meanwhile, the main fleet would position itself for what appeared to be a conventional orbital bombardment. Ralph found himself assigned to the surface team, working alongside Lieutenant Ford to create the illusion of a major ground assault. They established positions on a ridge overlooking the colony and began what humans called aggressive reconnaissance. "Why are we not actually attacking?" Ralph asked as they fired weapons toward the enemy positions without attempting to advance. "Because we don't want to win this fight," Ford explained. We want them to think they're winning it. This required a completely different mindset than anything in Rolf's military experience. Instead of seeking victory, the humans were deliberately courting apparent defeat. They made themselves visible targets, used obvious tactics, and even allowed the enemy to push them back from their positions, all while the real operation proceeded, invisibly below ground. "Infiltration Team Alpha is in position," came the whispered report from the tunnels. "Beginning Phase 2. Rolf watched the Ravager forces react exactly as Hayes had predicted. Confident in their superior firepower and defensive positions, they focused all their attention on the obvious threat from above. Their commander was probably laughing at human incompetence right now. That confidence lasted exactly 18 minutes. The first sign of trouble came when power fluctuations began affecting Ravager equipment. Weapon systems went offline randomly. Communication networks experienced interference, and defensive barriers flickered unpredictably. The infiltration teams were systematically sabotaging every critical system in the colony. "What's happening down there?" the Ravager commander demanded over intercepted communications. "Get those power systems back online." But the humans had learned the colony's infrastructure better than its current occupants. Every repair the enemy attempted was countered by another carefully placed disruption. The fortress was eating itself from within. "Phase 3 initiated," reported the infiltration team. "Environmental systems are now under our control." Rolf didn't understand the significance until Hayes explained it. Life support, atmospheric processing, artificial gravity, temperature control. Everything that makes the colony habitable. "You're going to kill them?" "We're going to convince them to leave," Hayes corrected. "There's a difference." What followed was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Instead of cutting life support entirely, the humans made it unreliable. Oxygen levels fluctuated just enough to cause fatigue and confusion. Temperature controls swung between uncomfortably hot and uncomfortably cold. Gravity generators created subtle variations that affected balance and coordination. The Ravagers found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't see in an environment they couldn't control. Every system they depended on had become unpredictable. They were still alive, but they were miserable and increasingly paranoid. "Sir, we're receiving surrender offers from individual Ravager units," Anderson reported with barely concealed amazement. "They're requesting permission to evacuate." "Granted," Hayes replied immediately. "Provide them with safe passage to their ships." Ralph watched in fascination as Ravager forces began abandoning the colony in increasing numbers. They weren't being driven out by superior firepower or tactical brilliance. They were being encouraged to leave by making their stay unbearable. "You defeated them without killing them," he observed. "Whenever possible," Hayes agreed. "Dead enemies stay dead, but living enemies can become allies under the right circumstances." Within 6 hours, New Geneva was back under human control with minimal casualties on either side. The Ravagers had simply decided that holding the colony wasn't worth the constant misery of trying to live there. They departed with what dignity they could salvage, never quite understanding how they had been outmaneuvered. As human engineers worked to restore normal operations to the colony, Ralph found himself profoundly changed by what he had witnessed. These humans fought wars unlike anything he had experienced. They won by being clever rather than strong, by being persistent rather than fierce, and by caring about their enemies as well as their allies. "I think I finally understand," he told Hayes, as they watched the last Ravager ship disappear into hyperspace. "Your people don't fight to prove your strength. You fight to create the world you want to live in." Hayes nodded slowly. "Every battle is a choice about what kind of future we're building. We prefer futures where more people get to be alive and free." For the first time in his military career, Ralph found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about warfare. Perhaps strength alone wasn't enough. Perhaps true victory required something more than the ability to destroy your enemies. Perhaps it required the wisdom to know when not to. 2 weeks after the liberation of New Geneva, Ralph found himself walking through the restored colony alongside General Hayes. The humans had not only repaired the damage from both battles, but had improved the infrastructure beyond its original capabilities. Children played in new parks built where weapons emplacements had once stood. "Your engineers work quickly," Ralph observed, watching a team install improved power systems that would be harder for future enemies to sabotage. "We've had practice rebuilding," Hayes replied. Humans have been destroying and reconstructing things for thousands of years. We've gotten pretty good at both. Ralph paused at a memorial wall where names of the fallen were inscribed in multiple languages. Human, Altaran, and even Ravager names appeared side by side. Some of the enemy dead were pirates who had been killed during the initial assault, but others were Ravagers who had died in accidents during the evacuation. You honor your enemies alongside your allies? They were all someone's family, Hayes said simply. Death in battle doesn't erase the person they were before they became soldiers. This conversation led to others as Ralph's assignment stretched beyond its original 3 months. He requested extensions twice, claiming he needed more time to complete his cultural evaluation of human military capabilities. The truth was more complicated. He was learning things that couldn't be captured in any formal report. Dr. Williams taught him about human concepts of medical ethics, including the treatment of wounded enemies. A wounded soldier is no longer a combatant, she explained while treating a Ravager who had been injured during the evacuation. At that point, they're just someone who needs help. Sergeant Lopez showed him how human squad tactics relied on individual initiative rather than rigid hierarchy. Everyone thinks, she said during a training exercise. If the plan falls apart, any soldier can become the leader. If I give a stupid order, it's my squad's duty to tell me it's stupid. Lieutenant Ford demonstrated human approaches to intelligence gathering that relied on building relationships rather than simply extracting information. People share more when they trust you, he explained. And they trust you more when you care about their welfare beyond just what they can tell you. But the most profound lesson came from an unexpected source. While helping to relocate the New Geneva refugees to permanent housing, Ralph met Maria Santos, an elderly woman who had lived through the Ravager occupation. You're the big alien soldier, aren't you? She asked, studying his massive frame with curious eyes rather than fear. My granddaughter wants to thank you for helping with the rescue. I did very little, Ralph replied awkwardly. Your own soldiers deserve the credit. Nonsense, Maria said firmly. You came back for us when you could have left safely. That's what matters. She invited him to dinner with her family, and Ralph found himself sitting around a table too small for his frame, sharing a meal with 3 generations of humans. They asked him about his home world, his people, his experiences in the military. They listened to his answers with genuine interest, treating him not as an alien observer but as a welcome guest. Why do you fight? Maria's son asked during the conversation. What makes war worth the cost? Ralph started to give the traditional Altaran answer about honor and glory, but the words felt hollow in this domestic setting. Looking at the faces around the table, he found himself thinking about the real answer. I used to fight to prove my strength, he said slowly. Now I think I fight to protect moments like this, to make sure families can sit around tables and share meals in safety. The conversation that night led to a breakthrough in his understanding. Humans didn't see military service as separate from civilian life. They saw it as an extension of their desire to protect and nurture the things they cared about. Every battle was ultimately about preserving the right of ordinary people to live ordinary lives. When his assignment finally ended, Ralph submitted a report to the Galactic Defense Coalition that was unlike anything he had originally planned to write. Instead of documenting human weaknesses, he found himself advocating for their strategic brilliance. Human military doctrine represents a fundamental evolution in warfare, he wrote. While other species fight to impose their will through superior force, humans fight to create conditions where conflict becomes unnecessary. They win wars by making their enemies prefer peace, he recommended immediate expansion of joint training programs and suggested that human officers be placed in command, positions for complex operations requiring coordination between multiple species. The report concluded with a request that surprised even himself. I respectfully request permanent assignment to human forces for continued study of their tactical innovations and strategic philosophy. Admiral Brooks granted the request during a ceremony at Titan Station. As Ralph received his new assignment orders, Hayes approached him with a question that had been months in the making. What changed your mind about us? The general asked. Ralph considered the question carefully. I came here believing that strength was the most important quality a warrior could possess. You taught me that strength without wisdom is just destruction. Wisdom without compassion is just calculation. But strength, wisdom, and compassion together can actually make the universe a better place. And now, Now I understand why humans win wars even when they shouldn't be able to. You don't fight against your enemies. You fight for your friends. That makes you unstoppable. Hayes extended his hand in the human greeting ritual that Rolth had once dismissed. This time, the Alteran commander took it without hesitation. Welcome to the team, Ralph. 6 months later, Rolth was leading a joint human-Alteran task force against a new Ravager incursion in the outer colonies. His tactical reports had become required reading at military academies across 3 star systems. Young Alteran warriors studied human case studies alongside traditional combat, doctrine, but the real measure of change came during a staff meeting when a junior officer suggested handling a hostage situation through direct assault. That approach would likely succeed, Ralph acknowledged. But success isn't the only consideration. What kind of victory do we want? One that rescues the hostages, or one that also preserves the possibility of future peace with the hostage takers? The officer looked confused. Does it matter, sir? Victory is victory. Rolf thought about Maria Santos and her family, about Private Davis carrying wounded civilians to safety, about Hayes choosing to risk everything for 200 strangers. He thought about the human concept of fighting, not just to win battles, but to build the kind of future worth living in. Victory without wisdom is just organized destruction, he said, unconsciously echoing lessons learned from watching humans at war. We're here to do better than that. Looking around the room at the mixed human and Alteran staff, Ralph realized that his transformation was just the beginning. Human military philosophy was spreading throughout the coalition forces, changing how entire species thought about conflict and peace. Perhaps that had been the real human strategy all along. Not just to win individual battles, but to make war itself evolve toward something more humane, to prove that even in the darkest circumstances, there was always a choice to be better than your enemies expected. It was, Ralph thought, the most human approach possible to fighting a war. Win by making everyone around you want to be more like you. And somehow, impossibly, it was working.